Welcome to our webinar on the future of Donbass. My name is Olesya Khromoychuk, and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London, which is a center for Ukraine-related educational and cultural activities. Okay, so today's webinar is part of the season of events that we have at the Institute, where we look at the history, culture, and identity of Donbass. Whenever we talk about Donbass, the devastation of the region and of its population caused by the ongoing war is obviously very prominent in these discussions. We have recently witnessed another escalation of violence at the front line, and it's really challenging to talk or to imagine what the future of the Donbass might look like when the war is over. Today, our speakers will consider what this future might hold for those parts of Donbass that have suffered most from Russian aggression in the last 7 years. They will discuss whether transitional justice is a feasible option in case of the war in eastern Ukraine, what peace-building methods could potentially work in Donbass, and how to best protect Ukrainian citizens remaining in the temporarily occupied territories. And it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, tonight's webinar moderator, Yuri Bender. He's a journalist covering private banking, asset management, and capital markets. He has launched several magazines and websites at the Financial Times Group. He moderates panel discussions on financial, business, and cultural issues in Europe, the US, Middle East, and Asia, and has reported from developing economies, including Malaysia, China, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. And Yuri also studied international relations at the University of Cambridge, and he wrote his master's thesis on the armed conflict in Eastern Ukraine. So, Yuri, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Olesya, and all at the Ukrainian Institute. Thank you particularly for that kind introduction and for organizing this wonderful opportunity to discuss this topic, which is so close to my heart, and I'm sure to those of so many of our viewers today. We will talk about the panelists' experiences and how these can inspire practical solutions in southeastern Ukraine. What can be done to bring the region and its population back to Ukraine once the war is over, and how we should prepare for this process from today. And I'm delighted to introduce three such inspiring panelists this evening. Stanislav Aseyev is a Ukrainian writer and journalist from Donetsk. Many of you will know his story. He lived under separatist control from 2014 while writing for Radio Free Europe and Ukrainian publications Дзеркало Тижня, Український тиждень, and Ukrainska Pravda under the pen name Stanislav Vasin. In June 2017, he was captured and unlawfully imprisoned by separatist militia forces for so-called extremism and spying. He was held captive and subjected to torture for nearly 3 years. He was released as part of a prisoner exchange in December 2019. In 2021, he was awarded the Taras Shevchenko National Prize for his book, In Isolation. Natalia Mirimanova is a conflict resolution expert. She's a scholar and practitioner with over 20 years experience of working in this sector in Russia, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, Moldova, the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, Cyprus, and Ukraine, where she was the project coordinator for the main peacekeeping body, the OSCE. Kateryna Busol is a Ukrainian lawyer specializing in international humanitarian and criminal law. At Chatham House, she is researching options for Ukraine's transitional justice policy to achieve justice and reconciliation in dealing with the consequences of the occupation of Crimea and the armed conflict in Donbass. She has also advised the Ukrainian government about the best practices of investigating and prosecuting international crimes, including cooperation with the International Criminal Court. Now, before I pose questions to our panelists, I would like to make a few introductory remarks about Donbass based on my regular visits there and dialogue with its inhabitants for both journalistic articles and academic research. There were several interesting phenomena which I noticed over the years leading up to the 2014 revolution. Donbass, the Donetsk basin of which the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk form the central part, is so different from the monolithic, Russified Rust Belt often painted by Western media. It is far from homogeneous ethnically, culturally, or socioeconomically, and home to a variety of actors with a range of identities. Various national groups have lived there in relative harmony for the last few decades, including Ukrainians, Russians, Jewish people, and a significant minority of ethnic Greeks residing on the shores of the Azov Sea in Mariupol. They run vibrant cafes selling delicious chebureki and still occasionally speaking the Rumaic dialect. The Donbass has been fought over many times in history by great powers and their local proxies. The latest conflict is really nothing new in historical terms. At the beginning of the 20th century, in 1904, the geographer Halford Mackinder predicted this Eurasian heartland, gripped between two pressures of Asian horsemen from the east and maritime Vikings from the west, would be perpetually contested by geopolitical rivals, with the intensity of the conflict increasing with industrialization, mining of natural resources, and the development of a railway network for transportation. During the Russian Revolution, I believe the Donbass changed hands more than 20 times between different factions. Not surprisingly, its inhabitants display a plethora of shifting identities from Ukrainian to Orthodox Pan-Slavic, post-Soviet, and citizens of the Russian world. People would regularly switch between these identities during conversations with them, sometimes in the space of a few minutes. As the political scientist Roman Shporlyuk wrote of Donbass in his series of essays in 1997 and 1998, some of these people are Soviet in the morning, Russian in the afternoon, and Ukrainian in the evening. Sometimes the order may vary. In parallel to these multiple identities, I observed a very strong regional affinity, with people identifying first the steppe, the mines, the football teams, and a unique collective culture of the Donbass. And then Ukraine would be second or third place in these identities. The regional identity always came first. 21st century surveys show 70% of Donetsk residents self-identifying with their region above all else. There also seems to be a growing generational divide, with a younger generation much more outward looking, prepared to feel Ukrainian and countenance the rationale for the anti-Yanukovych pro-European protests against their parents and grandparents, sometimes full of resentment about the USSR's downfall. Brought up on, the older generation were brought up on legends of the 1917 revolution, resistance against Nazi occupiers in the Second World War, in a strong collective working class coal mining culture, generally distrustful of Ukrainian nationalists. While the older generation are attached to their life, their property, and network of friends, the younger know there is no future whatsoever for them in occupied Donbass, that for education or economic opportunities, they must move to or spend time in Ukrainian government-controlled territory or Moscow or nearby Rostov-on-Don. This tendency for migration and depopulation is linked with a strong distrust of the West. Unlike Western Ukraine, where very few citizens of Donbass have visited Europe or the US, itinerant builders, nannies, and other odd jobbers are more likely to head to Russia to earn higher wages than they can locally. Moscow for many years was a home for builders from Luhansk Oblast. There was, however, a willingness to debate and discuss, to listen to all political dialogue, and to engage with those Ukrainian politicians who visited Donbass, who made genuine attempts to treat the local population with respect rather than talk down to them. The famous visits of the Soviet-era political dissident and former political prisoner Levko Lukyanenko to Donbass at the time of independence, when he was warmly embraced by the coal miners, showed that this post-industrial community is much more open to dialogue than many of them would give credit for. Look closely just below the surface, and you soon find a civil society much stronger than other areas of Ukraine, based on a whole network of post-Soviet clubs linked to the once prominent Komsomol, and now working very closely with schools, workplaces, and palaces of culture, organizing sport, weekend retreats, and a worrying brand of cultural education, venerating Soviet rather than Ukrainian heroes. This network, reenacting various historical events in festivals of the communist calendar, was able to quickly spread the word about pro-separatist meetings and propaganda, amplifying any messages being fed into the system by those at the helm of the kidnapped administration, which soon manifested itself as the LNR and DNR. But conversely, there is also a counterbalance in the form of a powerful private sector, which was very much there until the occupation and the problems of 2014. This employed hundreds of thousands of people, supporting both industrial workers and their families, prepared to listen to the views of their leaders and enact them at the ballot box and on the street. A loyalty to regional businessmen running their own fiefdoms, such as Rinat Akhmetov in particular, placed the reputations of these moguls well ahead of any politicians. It is against this background of a unique region in Ukraine, often labeled the Dikke Pole or the wild field by social scientists and historians, that I would like to frame our debate today. There'll be plenty of time for the audience to join our discussion, so please start thinking about your comments and questions. But I will start with some questions of my own for our august panelists. If I can start with Stas. Dobry wieczór, pane Stas.
Доброго вечора.
You grew up in Donetsk. As soon as Crimea was annexed, factory bosses in Donetsk heard local intelligence that predicted similar insurrection in their city. But the workers could not take this seriously, considering threats of separatist insurgency an absurd fantasy. Many were laughing when they heard this news. Yet several industrial plants were seized by Russian-backed militants in July 2014. Were you surprised when these armed groups around you began to take over government buildings and factories in Donetsk? And perhaps surprised at how the behavior of a minority of those around you began to change?
Ну, насправді, якщо так відповісти дуже коротко, то в липні 2014 року ні. Там вже було для мене все більш-менш зрозуміло. Але я завжди наводжу приклад 1 березня 2014 року, бо саме в цей день відбувся перший сепаратистський мітинг у Донецьку, на якому я також був присутнім з другом. Ми приїхали туди з Макіївки, щоб подивитися, що, власне, буде відбуватись. І на тому мітингу можна було побачити дуже багато різноманітних прапорів. Ну, перш за все, це прапори Радянського Союзу, це прапори сучасної Російської Федерації, триколори. І коли вже загальна маса людей рушила до Державної обладміністрації, а там була зайнята повністю центральна вулиця Артема, то деякі люди йшли з такими триколорами Донецької Народної Республіки. І, власне, тоді, 1 березня 2014 року, ніхто навіть не розумів, про що йдеться, про яку республіку йдеться і хто ці люди. Тобто я дуже чітко пам'ятаю, як я запитав свого друга, що це за прапори, що це за Донецька Народна Республіка. Ну і ми тоді до них дійсно відносилися як до якихось маргіналів. І це не тільки моя там позиція була, та позиція мого друга з Макіївки, хоча ми мешкали в тих містах і, власне, ніби як на той час думали, що розуміємо ситуацію. Насправді ні. Насправді ми нічого не бачили навіть на той час, тому що ця Донецька Народна Республіка, вона ще досить довго виглядала, як, знаєте, така собі організація. Це не держава, не квазідержава. А в 2014 році можна було почути, як лякають людей, які там порушують якісь правила поведінки, наприклад, на вулиці чи то в магазині, фразою «Я зараз визову ДНР». Тобто це навіть до голови не вкладалося, що це буде якась квазідержава. Але в липні 2014 року для мене вже було все очевидно в даному сенсі, тому що всі ті мої однолітки, яких я знав, вони вже воювали в ополченні так званому, вони влились до лавів бойовиків, хтось поїхав до Стрілкова, до Гіркіна, хтось поїхав до Горловки, і мені було абсолютно зрозуміло, що займають адміністративні будівлі, займають взагалі, я б сказав, такі будівлі, які мають стратегічне значення, в тому числі те, про що ви кажете, і заводи, і фабрики, тому що ці люди, власне, до 2014 року, я маю на увазі в даному випадку ту саму меншість, так, місцеве населення, вони здебільшого не мали нічого. А зараз, в 2014 році, їм запропонували стати чимось і впливати безпосередньо на історію. І треба визнати, що вони дійсно мали проросійські погляди вже на той час. Тут, до речі, звичайно, велику роль відіграв Майдан, яким їх дуже налякали інформаційно саме в російській медійній сфері. І це все вилилось в тому числі, що в липні 2014 року ці люди вже не тільки захоплювали якісь будівлі, але й намагались вже активно воювати на фронті проти збройних сил України. Тому, на жаль, для мене вже в липні 2014-го це більш-менш було зрозуміло, про що йдеться.
Stas, you've talked very eloquently about the behavior of quite a small number of people who were instrumental in seizing the administrations, in preparing the flags, in preparing various insignia of the self-styled statelets. How about the more general population of Donetsk? Were there people who you were friends with, whose attitudes you saw slowly changing to a position where you almost could not recognize these people?
Треба розуміти, що в 2014 році була катастрофічна інформаційна ситуація на тій території. Тобто, коли ви включали новини, а там вже пробивалися і російські телеканали, і навіть українські телеканали, які мали окрас проросійський, вони просто залякували тим, що Україна наразі це нацистська чи фашистська держава, що зараз приїдуть в Донецьк якісь бандерівці, які будуть просто вбивати, різати і вбивати. І, звичайно, це дуже вплинуло інформаційно на людей, які і зовнішньо виходили на вулицю, і вже, якщо ми кажемо про літо 2014 року, знаєте, то в Макіївці, якщо ви виходите з під'їзду зі свого будинку, то там зранку до вечора така суцільна шумова стіна. Тобто навколо рвуться снаряди, навколо гради, б'ють реактивна артилерія, і все це відбувається безпосередньо біля вашого будинку. І коли ви повертаєтесь до будинку, то ми не забуваємо, що ви включаєте телебачення і чуєте і бачите те, що вам пропонують, власне, проросійські сили. Тому дійсно своїх знайомих я просто не впізнавав. Вони були дуже інформаційно накручені. І що цікаво, навіть не ті люди, які пішли до лав бойовиків, тобто мої однолітки, а власне їх батьки. Тобто це старше покоління, яким зараз вже по 60 років, так? І вони значно більше ненавидили Україну, ніж ті люди, які пішли, їх сини, наприклад, які пішли до фронту. Тому що вони пішли воювати, і для них телевізор зник. Вони бачили зовсім іншу реальність вже на фронті. А ті, що залишались вдома, коли я з ними перетинався просто в місті, то це дійсно були інші психологічно інші люди, це правда.
Thank you, Stas, for setting the scene so eloquently. If I can bring in Natalia Mirimanova, if we look at the peacekeepers and mediators' role of bringing divided communities together, and Stas has talked about some of the ideological divisions, the divisions in viewpoints, but there's also physically divided communities, divided by the contact line, divided by a new frontier, divided by a river or a blown up bridge. Part of your role is making sure locals have access to water, energy, administrative services, and communication, most importantly, with relatives and neighbors. What is the feedback, Natalia, from people who live on either side of the contact line, whose livelihoods depend on moving freely? Do they now see themselves as citizens of Ukraine? Or are they beginning to identify with these self-styled statelets, the so-called LNR and DNR?
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you, Stas, for the introduction and for such an eloquent indeed lead-in. What I can say that the situation around the division and line of contact has not emerged immediately. By the way, it came later in time. It has changed very much significantly. So I was a part of several mediation efforts, including quiet diplomacy, so to speak, at the level of non-state organizations and entities, but also I advised OSCE that was trying to establish a national dialogue, or a sort of a national dialogue. If you remember, it was prior to the snap presidential elections in May. So what I can say that by and large, all these first attempts to mediate, to basically quench the fire, were not successful. And there are several reasons for that: internal, external, and lack of probably what you said, like lack of understanding that something extremely significant was happening. You know, there were still people, even in the summer of 2014, that were thinking, okay, you know, we'll leave for a couple of months and then we'll come back. It's something, just some kind of a short-term madness, right, that will end. So I remember that, for example, when we were trying to lobby, to advocate for keeping links with the population in the territories affected by the conflict, they were not called occupied yet back then in 2014, to you know, to keep supplying electricity, water, paying pensions and other social payments was a major problem at the time. And there were like objective obstacles to that, but also political obstacles. It was, I remember, you know, my own conversations and other, you know, individual people from humanitarian organizations that were making this a strong case for the need to continue somehow administer social payments. It was a big thing back then, and I think that eventually, you know, when we all collectively managed and some kind of a proper system of checkpoints was established, but still people had to travel to these checkpoints, and this travel, you know, was something unaffordable for many. So time was lost. I can say that in this first mediation efforts, we collectively, I don't know if I can think of myself as one of these mediators, failed to establish a political dialogue. The first meetings, this national round tables of national unity, they were called, right? They did not result in any kind of agreement between these sides back then, and then later attempts to establish humanitarian links, right, to keep them intact, were also not very successful. Eventually, it was repaired, but I think that this precious time was lost. And I was just looking into a paper that I wrote in the summer of 2014, precisely about what are the ways to administer social payments and why the state authorities need to keep ties, links with the population in the territories kept by insurgents, for if we may say so. And there are political reasons, this famous battle for hearts and minds. There are legal reasons that effectively it violates the constitution and the human rights, law and all this kind of stuff. There are pragmatic reasons, like if you want to stop epidemics, for instance, or there was a big topic about big industries and factories being in such a shape that some kind of chemical explosions or other poisonous substances, could have poisoned the rivers, etc. around. So there was a whole host of reasons for the central government to be in touch, to communicate with the population, at least in the territories that are currently occupied. But it was not very effective, very successful. And as a result, I can say that in my survey in December 2019, and prior to that, people in the non-government controlled territories of Donbass, they keep remembering that. They keep referring to, like, Ukraine has cut us off. Now, this, of course, we need to take with a pinch of salt, but nevertheless, it's a very common line that residents there put forward, that, like, Ukraine did not want us to be with them. They cut us off. They shelled us, bombed us, etc. So this is a perspective of an average Philistine, so to speak, an average person who didn't choose sides, etc. So going back to your question in terms of this mediation, I wish this very pragmatic humanitarian mediation could have been more successful at the very first days and months of the military hostilities. And after that, after the full-scale war broke out, any war has its own logic, and sort of civilian logic doesn't work there. And then, what happened, the worst, what could have happened, that this war actually united people on the other side. They had this experience together. It is decaying now, by the way, steadily, but for quite some years, people stick together because of solidarity and because of this experience of war.
But Natalia, what I do see, though, is that I hear this exactly what you say, the people I speak to in Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukraine's forgotten about us, they've cut us off. But I also hear that when they cross the contact line to collect pensions in Kharkiv or one of the nearby cities, some of them will spend a few days there and they'll feel more Ukrainian for that week or so before they go back to the occupied territory. So it's quite a fluid identity.
Absolutely, I can't agree more. And this is exactly what I wanted to say, that these people resent them being labeled as less Ukrainian. They, very much feel themselves as Ukrainians. Of course, there is some part, I cannot tell you exactly in terms of percentages, that do feel themselves as a part of the Russian world. But overall, again, in December 2019, by and large, for instance, Donetsk residents, they were for the reintegration into Ukraine, and they felt themselves Ukrainians, and they did not feel themselves as a part of Russia. In Luhansk, it's always been slightly different. Luhansk is more pro-Russian, if I may say. But even there, there is a significant number of people who would prefer to be again a part of Ukraine, and not as a republic, but as a pre-2014 sort of part of Ukraine. I also have to say that they all, being normal people, they understand that it cannot happen overnight, and they do see some kind of a special status as a transition thing, because you cannot bring people back together, after all this trauma and stuff, and people fear being persecuted and all sorts of aggression being unleashed. But exactly, you're absolutely right that these people feel Ukrainian, and when I ask them, like, would you like to go back to Ukraine, and they say, like, what do you mean? We live in Ukraine. So it's a very sort of paradoxical state of mind of the residents there.
And this transitional status which Natalia describes, if I can bring in Kateryna, we need to talk about the practical implications of this. There are several thousand armed insurgents in Donbass. I'm sure you can give me a good estimate. And many people who worked in illegal administrations controlled by a mixture of organized criminals and Russian government officials and other ex-Ukrainian local government officials. What does your blueprint for peace and reconciliation envisage will happen to these actors?
Thank you, Yuri. Well, I'm not sure we've got the blueprint for it. I would just set that there are different components. Obviously, there are prosecutions, domestic and international courts. There should be some sort of a truth mechanism, whether it's going to be in a separate truth-seeking commission, or it might be supervised, as there are rumors in Ukraine, by the Institute of the National Remembrance. There will also be a very important component, and it actually should have been in place already, on reparations to the survivors of the grave human rights violations. And of course, there are also the institutional reforms. These are the four core components, judicial and non-judicial, of what we frame as transitional justice. And I would say that in terms of the punishment, which I think is a very narrow approach to addressing any armed conflict, including such a complex situation as Donbas, punishment or the prosecution will deeply depend on the level of involvement of a particular person in the crimes in Donbas, and whether those were some minor offenses, or the conduct of this or that person contributed to, for instance, war crimes or crimes against humanity. So, for instance, Stas, as we know from the mass media a couple of weeks ago, published in collaboration with the Bellingcat and other authorities, state authorities, the list of 3 people, the basically top commanders of Izolatia, where they allegedly were involved in war crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. So, of course, this type of persons are being prosecuted domestically in Ukraine, and Ukraine is also doing its best, both on the state, but also the civil society. They submit the evidence to the International Criminal Court, inviting the court to open the investigation and prosecute these particular top criminals. But I would say that it is very good that Ukraine is developing this very strong prosecutorial approach. But I think what's quite negative is that it is dominating in Ukraine's vision for peace and reconciliation. Ukraine has not done much in terms of reparations, for instance. So the emphasis on the victims, or on the victims of particular crimes, for instance, conflict-related sexual violence, or the emphasis on the victimization of women and children in the conflict, has not really been developed, and there are no specialized programs, domestic or international, of helping such victims. And this is the lens which Ukraine is also set to develop. And of course, when we speak about the institutional reform component, it's crucial for any peace and justice initiative, because, for instance, without the reform of the judiciary, we cannot really say that good prosecutions will translate into justified convictions or justified acquittals. And bringing in the international experience, for instance, the Truth Commission in El Salvador actually recommended that all justices of the Supreme Court be dismissed and the new set of justices be appointed. So Ukraine might actually end up with recommendations like that, with the transformative institutional reform, which will then be crucial to setting the first steps to justice for Donbass and Crimea.
Thank you for that very detailed summary, Kateryna. And if I can bring Stas back in, Stas, you endured some great hardships in prison after sending regular dispatches from occupied Donetsk to media under an assumed name. I've met others who had to share cells with separatists for months, and others who were abused by officials of the DNR or LNR in prison, none of them for as long as you were, but they tell me they could never live again with these types of people in a free Donetsk after reintegration into Ukraine. But if we look at countries like Northern Ireland, the terrorists, some people call them freedom fighters, depending on which side you're on, who once shot at or blew up their neighbors, are now serving as politicians with their former foes in one parliament. Do you envisage any sort of peace where you could eventually share the land and its facilities with former separatist activists and fighters?
Ну, дивіться, є суто формальна сторона питання для тих людей, які мали проукраїнські погляди і виїхали з тієї території у 2014 році. Зараз вже йде 8-й рік війни. У деяких цих людей народились діти, вони пішли вже до школи, підуть, так, і, власне, в них є зовсім інше життя, по відношенню до того життя, яке вони втратили чи залишили, можна так сказати, у Донецьку у 2014 році. Ці люди відверто кажуть, що вони, власне, вже не повернуться на ту територію, навіть якщо технічно, скажімо, завтра ці території звільнять, тому що, по-перше, їм нема куди повертатися, їх житло або пограбували, або вони дуже швидко змогли все ж його якось продати там за якісь копійки на той час, вони просто дійсно не уявляють себе поруч із тими навіть сусідами, які там залишилися, ходили на той референдум за Донецьку Народну Республіку, незалежність, і все ще мають проросійські погляди. Щодо мене, то не можна сказати, що я переїхав з тієї території, мене винесло хвилею звідти, хвилею таку у 2,5 роки. І тут треба розуміти, що до мого арешту, ті мої однолітки, які пішли до бойовиків, до лав бойовиків, вони не знали про мої погляди, про українське. Звичайно, що я їх приховував. Тепер після арешту ця історія вже стала дуже голосною, і вони, звичайно, знають про це, і я знаю, що вони воювали у лавах тих бойовиків. І якщо, знову ж таки, собі уявити, що я повертаюсь до Макіївки чи Донецька, зустрічаю їх на вулиці, то я, насправді, мені дуже важко відповісти на питання, що ж в такому випадку відбудеться. Ну, можливо, з дуже такими близькими людьми, яке я все життя провів разом з ними до арешту, ну, можливо, ми знайдемо щось на 5 хвилин, що сказати один одному, а з іншими ні. І тому для себе в мене також дуже чітка відповідь, що я не бачу особистих таких засад, на яких би я зміг повернутися до того регіону. Це не технічні причини, хоча в нас там також житла вже не залишилося, я вивіз звідти маму, і, власне, більша частина родини в мене вже тут. Але суто з таких ментальних причин, то мене більше обурює навіть не той факт, що мене там заарештували, катували і всі ці речі, а той факт, що ці люди в більшості своїй не повірять тому, що я буду їм розповідати. То, через що я пройшов. І це трішечки нівелює мій досвід. І я думаю, що в тому числі по цієї причини я просто не зможу ходити з ними однією вулицею.
Thank you so much, Stas, for that very frank answer. There is something amidst that tragedy. There is some optimism that Stas says there are some people he would be prepared to spend 5 minutes talking to, though not others. And Natalia, if we start looking at these practicalities, we've seen successful peacekeeping operations in some countries which you've been involved in Cyprus, for instance. I remember in my youth, the local populations of Greeks and Turks, they were at each other's throats on the murder mile of Nicosia's Ledra Street in the early 1970s. And I remember the refugees coming to the UK from Cyprus at that time. Now that street, once more, I was there to film a video a couple of years ago. It's once more ethnically mixed. and the people come and go very freely across the border crossing with minimum fuss. There are Greeks and Turks living next door to each other again. This gradual reconciliation of communities, however, took more than 40 years of stop-start peace talks to achieve. Will it take just as long or perhaps even longer in Ukraine, or do you have hopes that there may be some sort of faster resolution?
Well, if you ask an ordinary Greek Cypriot or a Turkish Cypriot, I'm not sure they will share your optimism about a very successful peace process. But things are relative, of course. Of course, given the state of affairs in 1975 and today, Cyprus has gone, a long way, clearly, absolutely clearly. But then the question is whether 40 or 50 years were necessary, and couldn't this same thing happen 40 years ago, right? It's a very complex thing, and there are various how would I say theories about why the Cyprus process, for instance, is taking so long, right? And actually one of the reasons being that there is no acute war, and it's unlikely that any kind of a war will break out, and the sides have time basically to bargain and to get the best deal possible. And then there is this UN peacekeeping mission that is the oldest mission in the world, by the way. It was deployed in 1964, believe it or not, and it's still there. But you're right that there was indeed a transformation on behalf of the societies, not entire societies. It is still not the majority, I would say, especially of the Greek Cypriot community, that are for the reunification as a bizonal, bicommunal federal state. But you're right that people cross the line, and I can even look. I've been working on Cyprus for quite some years, and I remember a colleague, a Greek Cypriot, who was a refugee from the or IDP from the north, who would say, like, I will never cross the line. And then 2 years later, he did cross the line, and now he goes back and forth. So there is a normalization, of course, of interaction. However, the political positions are quite far. I mean, and the solution is not in sight. Now, the question is, does it get in the way? Does it prevent people from living normal lives? It does. It does, definitely, because Turkish Cypriots, they still live in this unrecognized, non-recognized territory with very limited possibilities, although I have to say that they've done probably the most to have some kind of an exit strategy, so to speak. But I will tell you a very, very brief story about how this first, in 2004, when this letter street precisely was open. A friend of mine, a Greek Cypriot, he was also an IDP and refugee from the north. He said that, we decided to cross to the north and see. And they waited for 24 hours in a queue of cars. You can imagine, right? So basically every Greek Cypriot wanted to cross. So they stayed in line for 24 hours, and then they crossed. And he was telling me, we were shocked to see, wow, they have highways. Wow, they have cars. So you can imagine what kind of propaganda people were growing in, right? And the most shocking thing for the Greek Cypriots who crossed was that Turkish Cypriots were opening their houses and inviting Greek Cypriots to visit. And even those who came to their abandoned houses where Turkish Cypriots were living at the time, this guy, he went to his house as he remembered it, and there was this Turkish Cypriot lady who collected all the things that they left behind in a box and handed him, and it was 30 years later. So people change and societies changed, but I would say the amount of international attention, funding, pressure, all sorts of privileges that Cyprus was getting is extraordinary, and Ukraine is not there. Plus, there was a lot of important external geopolitical changes that contributed to the reconciliation in Cyprus. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but to the process of reconciliation. One of them being the reconciliation between Turkey and Greece. and Turkey becoming a member of NATO, and this whole like European fairy tale part of Turkey's history. But also the accession to the European Union of the Republic of Cyprus. That was also a very important incentive for the Turkish Cypriots to seek closer ties and reintegration in the end. So I can say that it takes time, it takes a lot of money, but it's not a panacea. So the key is inside the societies, you know, and this is, and how to get this right. I mean, this is $1 million question.
Well, Natalia has very interestingly there talked about the juxtaposition of the geopolitical negotiations and what's going on inside the society itself and the changing outlook of the people. And I'd like to bring in Kateryna on this point, because if we look, for instance, at how the major port city and industrial hub of Mariupol managed to stay under Ukrainian control, this was a very painstaking operation. There was a special operations team of propagandists working for another tycoon or oligarch with a questionable past, Serhii Taruta, who many of you are familiar with. This team, they went from factory to college to hospital to industrial plant, convincing the locals that their economic and societal interests would be best served if they chose to stay part of Ukraine. Would you like to see more of this mass street and workplace educational conversation about the future of Donbass?
Thank you, Yuri. I would try to generalize. I think what you've just talked about is connected with two important things, with decentralization and with strategic communication. I like bringing up the example of COVID-related amnesties and how the perception of these amnesties in Ukraine can tell us volumes about what kind of a debate we're going to have about the war-related amnesties. So Ukraine, like all other major states during COVID, following the recommendations of the UN and other international organizations dealing with human rights, initiated granting amnesties to the persons who are convicted for minor offenses or who have served much of their sentences because they needed to free up the prisons to ensure social distancing. And the amnesties were not agreed upon. So there was a strong resistance from the society and from the media, because there was the manipulation in the public discourse that, you know, the grave criminals will appear in the streets. And I think it was quite illustrative, again, as to what manipulation Ukraine can expect with the war-related amnesties, because even though under international law, and that connects us with the first question, under international law, the perpetrators of war crimes, the grave violations of human rights, such as torture, sexual violence, persecution, they may not receive amnesties, but the perpetrators of the minor crimes, they might receive them. And there is no scenario for how to do that. So every state drafts their own approach to it. And Ukraine should really learn to communicate on the ground, depending on the particularities of a particular region, of a particular population, to translate basically its policy and its vision behind a proposed specific transitional justice mechanism. And the second component, as I said, should be decentralization. So this also connects us with the communities and with the workers, like you brought up the example. So for instance, any potential truth-seeking mechanism, because it looks not just into the specific violations perpetrated during the armed conflict, it actually looks into what causes led to the conflict, what causes allowed a society to be manipulated in the conflict. So these truth commissions in a number of states, for instance, in Brazil, they did have many regional offices, because the society would actually trust more something which is more local and not situated in Kyiv or in Lviv. They would rather turn up to the people and speak to the people whom they know. And such approach, I think Ukraine should also adopt, like a certain like hybrid approach where there will be more local initiatives with more trust from the local communities, especially in Donbas, as they're very diverse, with then something more central uniting this narrative. The final point would probably be the educational component, because you also mentioned children. Many truth commissions around the world allowed the testimonies of children because it showed a very specific lens and a very specific perception of what has happened in the country. So I think this is important, and many truth commissions, for instance, would also issue like child-friendly reports, which would not go into the details of all the turmoil and trauma which had been happening during an armed conflict, but they would at least explain to the younger generation how complicated the process was. And it's a really great hope that Ukraine would also follow this domain and will speak not just to the adults, but also to the children on the school and on the university level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kateryna. And this educational message, I'd like to bring in Stas to talk about this. I mentioned earlier on about these post-Komsomol youth networks that are very much still prevalent in Donbass, and I'm sure you'll know all about this, Stas, because you lived in Donetsk and spent time in other areas of Donbass. It was very curious to me visiting these palaces of culture, and I could see Soviet festivals being reenacted, pictures of Lenin on the wall, and this was during Yushchenko's presidency, and everything was about glorifying the Soviet Union. And I asked the workers at these centers who was funding this, and it was being funded by the Ukrainian central government in Kyiv to still spreading a Soviet message in Donbass. And what I would like to ask you, Stas, do you think these networks, because they're quite powerful, can be used to spread a more conciliatory message, a more Ukrainian unifying message in the future?
Ну, насправді, коли я вийшов з полону, то мені, звичайно, я випав, скажімо так, з реальності на 2,5 роки. І як тільки я опинився у Феофанії, це така лікарня, так, куди нас всіх привезли після звільнення, то до мене прийшли вже люди, які, власне, ці 2,5 роки боролись за моє звільнення, і сказали наступну річ, що ви не уявляєте, наскільки Російську Федерацію дратують вихідці з Донеччини, які мають проукраїнські погляди. Але ці люди, які зараз знаходяться у Києві, вони не є згуртованими. І вони кожен, ну, я б сказав так, скапсулірувався так за своєю якоюсь особистою образою, чи то на Російську Федерацію, чи то навіть на державу Україну, і не мають якогось ядра, яке б дійсно можна було використати в інформаційному сенсі для того, щоб впливати на населення на тих територіях, де ще підконтрольне, які є підконтрольні українській владі на Донеччині, я маю на увазі. Це ж стосується, до речі, і людей, які пройшли фронт з боку України, тобто Збройних сил України, і вони є вихідцями саме з Донеччини. І як мені сказала одна журналістка у Києві одразу ж після звільнення, що вони так мають свої невеличкі паби, бари, де їм ніхто не скаже, що їх туди не посилали. Так? І от вони там у 10, можливо, 15 людей сидять, і, власне, це не є таким загальним впливом на суспільну думку в інформаційному сенсі. Тому, безперечно, досвід проукраїнського населення Донеччини, він вкрай важливий, перш за все, для вже нового покоління, яке зараз навчається, наприклад, у школах. Але так, щоб я б не сказав, що цей досвід можна використовувати наразі глобально на підконтрольній чи тим більше на непідконтрольній території, тому що на непідконтрольній території ці люди, ну в тому числі я, є зрадниками, як вони люблять казати, народу Донбасу. хоча зовсім не зрозуміло так формулювання досі для мене, що це за народ такий, але тим не менше вони вважають нас зрадниками, і це, до речі, можна ж почути і про людей, які зараз з Донеччини наповнюють мінську підгрупу, і гуманітарну, і політичну. Тобто Денис Казанський, Сергій Гармаш – це журналісти з Донеччини, з Донецька, власне, і люди, які сидять по ту сторону барикад, так би мовити, блокпостів, вони вважають, що вони не мають права представляти державу України на цих перемовинах, бо вони зрадили Донбас, тому що, власне, в 2014 році переїхали звідти до Києва. Хоча кожен із них не просто переїхав, а той же Сергій Гармаш, наприклад, він виїжджав, коли вже його офіс обстрілювали з автоматів, власне, і вони це зробили не за своєю волею. Тому я б не робив скажімо так, я б не мав якихось ілюзій стосовно того, що ми маємо таке інформаційне ядро, яке може впливати інформаційно на сьогоднішній день на суспільну думку.
Thank you for that full and frank reply, Stas. I'm just going to ask one very brief question to Natalia before we move into the Q&A. We'll move to the Q&A in 1 minute because we've got some fantastic questions and I'd like to get through as many of them as possible. But Natalia, the oligarchs, they are blamed in many quarters for the chaos which ensued in 2014. Rinat Akhmetov in particular. But now these oligarchs, they're reinventing themselves as peacekeepers, and obviously they want to be involved in a post-integration settlement, and they want their fiefdoms back and they want their assets back. Are you prepared to work with the oligarchs in their new incarnation as peacekeepers?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that all oligarchs are sort of the same breed, and some happen to be on the wrong side and others on the right side of history. But it is a pertinent question, actually, because if in my first attempt to find an entry point into this emerging Ukrainian crisis back in 2014, I was looking and searching for a group of actors that would be relevant, influential, and independent, and this was private sector, whom I discovered. And my first, this first report that I wrote, my first study about the fate of the private sector of Donbas was, quite an event. But what I discovered throughout my research was that, apart from Rinat Akhmetov, there are hundreds and thousands of super creative business people in Donetsk and Luhansk. For me, it was a discovery, I have to say, and I had all the stereotypes, but I was absolutely surprised how progressive the business sector especially of Donetsk was. And the majority of these people, they went back they went to Ukraine proper. With some of them moved their entire staff, their enterprises. Some others were not able to do that, but they moved and started new businesses. So what I want to say that this sort of entrepreneurial spirit is often thought as alien to Donbass, which is not. It is a part of the Donbass culture. And if we talk about oligarchs, I may be wrong, but I don't think that oligarchs from the east or from the west are different individuals. They've all made their money, their fortunes. We know how. Rinat Akhmetov himself, of course, is a controversial figure. I may say so. But if you go and ask people in the occupied Donbass, many would say that Akhmetov's humanitarian aid was saving their lives in the first days and months of the war. And I go back to my first point, that this was a crucial battle for hearts and minds, that the Ukrainian leadership back then didn't know how to win. And people like Rinat Akhmetov, and I would thank him because he indeed was saving people's lives and saving and selling food, etc. With what intentions we can only speculate. But the truth on the ground was this, and this is what people saw with their very eyes. I think that until the oligarchic structure persists in Ukraine, oligarchs will be taking advantage of whatever crisis, political crisis, or God forbid, military crisis there are there.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I think that's a vital topic there. And we've got some fantastic questions. And the first one, I think, is Simon Pirani. If you can take the screen, please, Simon.
Yeah. Hello, Yuri, and thank you very much, all of you, for presenting this picture of these overlapping and complex identities in the east of Ukraine. Having heard that, my question was provoked when, Kateryna, you mentioned that some people want to put the Institute of National Memory as the organization that would start the truth and reconciliation process. I'm sorry, but my information was out of date, and I was thinking about the Institute and the anger that it provoked among historians, myself included, when it wanted to impose the most nationalist possible version of history on everybody. And I thought, when you said that, I thought, my God, I can't think of anybody who would be less appropriate to deal with all the complexities that you've spoken about. Now, because we're living in Zoom world, I then quickly searched, and I find that the leadership has changed. It happens so often in Ukrainian institutions. But does that mean that somebody with some understanding and common sense is going to be in charge, do you understand the danger that I'm talking about, I suppose, is my question now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And actually, I shared your concern when I heard the rumors, and I should emphasize that, again, those were just the rumors that the Institute might be in charge of get certain role in the truth-seeking process, but nothing is set in stone yet. But I would agree with you that it's not just about the leadership. Unfortunately, there are certain dimensions about the Institute's past that might make its input in any initiative a bit controversial. So I think, especially for such a subtle component of transitional justice as truth-seeking, I think the Institute could be very valuable in, for instance, catalyzing the further opening of the archives, or doing certain documentation, or providing the space basically for the documents which are emerging in the truth-seeking process. But I would agree with you, because of the subtlety of the issue, it would be better to have a new separate institution, a truth commission, or I don't know, a commission of inquiry, whatever they call it, but it should be something separate and something new, with the participants there from different regions of Ukraine, and definitely not just lawyers, but they should be from different backgrounds. So I support that it should be something separate from the Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. And the next question, I believe, is from James Bolton Jones.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much to everyone for such a fascinating discussion. My question is basically the comparison with Cyprus. I thought was interesting, and someone said that one of the key factors was the change in the geopolitical situation between Turkey and Greece. Obviously, the situation between Russia and Ukraine is very complex, but to what extent? I mean, what needs to happen in an ideal world, maybe, for between Russia and Ukraine for reconciliation in the Donbass to succeed?
Would you like to take that one, Natalia?
Sure. Thank you very much for this question, and I wish I had the answer. But what I would like to say, again, we learn from the past. Had certain mistakes being avoided at the beginning, we wouldn't have found ourselves in today's, including geopolitical situation that is so much worse than in 2014. We see how the Russian regime is basically degrading from authoritarian to dictatorship. And today Putin wants to withdraw from the Open Skies Agreement. So we are reaching the point that seems to be a point of no return, like ruptured relations between the European Union and Russia. So the geopolitical situation is very, very unfortunate, I would say, in this respect. Having said that, I think that the most important thing has always been throughout this crisis and remains today for Ukrainian leadership, civil society, whoever, different parts of the Ukrainian society to generate internal energy, if I may say, for the humanization of the population in the non-controlled territories, right? And it is happening. You know, the degree of the rhetoric is less harsh than it used to be in the first years. But again, you know, just look at some, you know, very few but still informative surveys about what people miss on this other side, and what they miss being treated as humans. Okay, so this is, I think, the best that Ukraine can do in the current geopolitical situation, because I do not see really any help from the outside.
Thank you, Natalia. Please keep these questions coming. They're absolutely fantastic. There's one coming from Christy Davis, and I'd like to direct this one to Stas Aseyev. How is the cultural heritage, the art, archives, books in the Donbass, particularly the more war-torn areas? Is any of this being saved and preserved? Is there any movement by the librarians, by the archivists? Is anybody hiding and moving this literature so that it's not destroyed? And what can the international community do to help?
Ні, ну безперечно, така локальна робота ведеться в різноманітних українських фондах, але тут проблема в іншому, що якщо ми кажемо про чи то сучасну історію війни на Донбасі, чи то історію часів радянських, то ми зіштовхуємося з двома абсолютно різними наративами. І ніякі, вибачте, папери у архівах, ніякі документи, фотографії не можуть на сьогоднішній день провести спільний знаменник між російською, наприклад, історіографією, розумінням історії і тих самих же, власне, документів, і сучасною українською історіографією, бо на сьогоднішній день в Україні і Росії історія є інструментом політичним. Це не можна сказати, що це така наука в класичному сенсі, як її розуміють на Заході. І це можна побачити, до речі, і по нинішній війні, коли вже ми маємо масу технічних засобів. Це не середина 20-го сторіччя, коли все це фіксується на відео. Але, наприклад, та ж сама ситуація з обстрілом на Босе в Донецьку, коли знищили громадський тролейбус, загинуло дуже багато людей. І з українського боку на сьогоднішній день всі знають, що це зробили місцеві так звані козаки. А з того боку, в тому числі і з Російської Федерації, кожного року на тому місці трагедії влаштовується реквієм пам'яті загиблих від української агресії. Ну, тобто ми бачимо ті самі ж фотографії, ті самі результати того обстрілу, але зовсім інша нарація, яка буде подаватись у школах Донецька і інших окупованих міст як загибель людей від рук української армії. А в Україні, власне, це вже війшло у книжки по історії, як от такий епізод, коли, власне, бойовики обстріляли самі себе. І те ж саме, власне, відбувається з історією тих часів, коли, я маю на увазі радянських, коли менше значно було технічних засобів, але на сьогоднішній день то є, ну, не є, скажімо так, панацея, яка б могла провести якусь спільну межу між людьми от, по різні боки барикад.
Thank you very much, Stas. And there's another question for you, Stas, from Sasha Dovzhik. And Sasha is saying that you mentioned, first of all, he's saying, thank you for all your work and courage, for the tireless attempts to share that which cannot be shared. He takes his hat off to you, as we all do. And you mentioned earlier that the the most aggressive fighters for the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, were the 60-year-olds, the older people. Sasha wants to know, had this same cohort of people, had they also welcomed Ukrainian independence 20 or 30 years earlier? How and when did they lose faith in Ukraine?
Це насправді дуже цікаве і важке питання, бо я стосовно тих людей, які в 2014-2015 році дійсно підтримували ці так звані республіки, я стосовно них не знаю, що вони робили в 91-му році, дійсно, яку позицію вони мали, бо на початок 2014 року вони були проросійські налаштовані, а з початком 2014 року, з початком тих подій, вони стали просто радикально, ну, я б сказав, навіть якісь психічні перетворення зробили з людьми на фоні тієї інформації, яка подавалась. І я не впевнений, що в 91-му році ці люди раділи, скажімо так, набуттю якоїсь, не якоїсь, а конкретно незалежності України в даному випадку, так? І ну не можу так коректно відповісти за них, тому що дійсно не мав з ними тих розмов, щоб запитати їх, яка їх позиція була в 91-му році. Але так з розмов в 2014-му році, то вони всі були зорієнтовані на радянське минуле, безперечно.
Thank you very much, Stas. And Lucy, next, Lucy Ash, I think, has been waiting in the wings for a while.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, Lucy, loud and clear.
Okay, and I was just going to ask, this is really for Stas, this question, what kind of support is there for people in Donetsk who have maybe pro-Ukrainian views? I mean, how much are they supported by small businesses, by the church, by academics? Is there anyone they can turn to for support? How much room for dissent is there? And also, what about international humanitarian organizations? What's their presence there now? Thanks.
Ну, власне, що стосується непідконтрольної території, то я думаю, що все, що, ну, скажімо так, вони могли зробити в цьому сенсі, я маю на увазі міжнародні організації, вони вже зробили і далі нема куди йти, бо там не залишилось жодних таких міжнародних організацій, які б робили гуманітарну допомогу. Тобто, наприклад, там була організація People in Need, чеська, але бойовики, власне, окупаційний уряд вирішив, що вони є агентами іноземних якихось спецслужб і, власне, зробили їм видворення за межі тієї так званої республіки. Ті люди, які знаходяться в сірій зоні, то тут, ну, звичайно, вони живуть звичайними такими буденними потребами, просто їжа, бо часто дуже просто в найближчому їх оточенні, десь там в кілометрів, 2-3, немає жодного, звичайно, магазину, де можна було б так купити. Якщо це похилого віку людина, то це, звичайно, проблема. І це банально навіть будівельні матеріали, бо їх будинки дуже пошкоджені тими обстрілами, які досі йдуть. І тому от тут можна було б щось зробити, скажімо так, з технічної сторони. Але на окупованій території я не думаю, що зараз наразі навіть хтось вирішить просто навіть намагатись так співпрацювати з тими людьми, які представляють, так би мовити, окупаційний уряд.
Thank you again, Stas. The next question, I believe, is from William Risch. William, the screen is yours.
Thanks. Yes, this was to all of the panelists. Is the chance of reconciliation realistic without the Donbass region becoming an autonomous unit within Ukraine, which has been a problem for the Ukrainian side of the conflict?
Okay, let's start with Natalia.
Well, if you ask me, I would say that there is no reason whatsoever for any kind of autonomous reason, not because I'm against autonomy, so normally I'm for, but if we trace back the roots of the conflict, of the current conflict in Donbass, they are not, identity-based. It is a very much constructed conflict, very much manufactured. Therefore, again, like people of Donbass, a newly forged category that doesn't really exist, would not help, right? In the cases of ethnic conflict or religious conflict, I would say that yes, autonomy is an arrangement that would contribute to de-escalation and peace. In the case of Donbas, if we talk about hypothetical reintegration, I think that the best that could happen is a proper decentralization, as it's going on in Ukraine, with its ups and downs, of course, but properly functioning communities, properly functioning administrations, and that's it. However, it's a major question how to get there. But no, I don't think that autonomy is a key to reconciliation. It might be even detrimental.
And can we bring in Kateryna on the same question?
I actually agree with what Natalia has said. I would probably add that this human dimension of Ukraine's legal and transitional justice effort, for me as a lawyer, is a key. As I said, there should be more focus on the survivors, and there should be more engagement with the local communities of Donbas in terms of seeing the needs of the survivors of particular crimes. I would provide a very striking example, which was striking for me, both as a citizen, as a woman, and as a lawyer, that the survivors, even of the conflict-related sexual violence, would say that one of the principal forms of reparation for them would be the recognition that it was Russia who was the aggressor and the cause of the conflict. And it's something that the majority of the Ukrainians or the state authorities which deal with these crimes would not know unless they engage with this very local human dimension of what has been happening. And same as I said with the truth-seeking commission, or the truth-seeking mechanism, it should be very community-based and community-rooted. And once that is provided, I think once the survivors and once the internally displaced persons from Donbas see that engagement, I think it will create a very solid, potentially solid human fabric for uniting Eastern Ukraine with the rest of the country. Thank you.
And Stas, what is your view about the potential of having an autonomous unit inside Ukraine as part of the transition?
Власне, питання автономії взагалі не є тотожнім питанню примирення, тому що на автономії можуть наполягати люди, які мають чітку ідентичність, яка відмінна від ідентичності загальної кількості мешканців іншої частини країни. В разі, у випадку тих людей, які мешкають зараз на окупованій частині, то тут, як правильно сказали, вже їм пропонують нарацію народ Донбаса, яка досі не прижилася, тому що не зрозуміло, хто це такі, так? Ту територію наповнюють дуже багата кількість етносів, але не існує народу Донбасу, як, наприклад, існують чеченці. Так? І тому питання автономії, воно не вирішує питання конфлікту, бо суть цього конфлікту зовсім не в якоїсь автономії. І якщо ви запитаєте тих людей, то більшість з них скоріш буде орієнтована на приєднання до Російської Федерації, ніж отримання якихось там автономних прав в рамках держави України. Тому я думаю, що це навіть не питання наразі.
And we have a question from Mattia Nellis, which I can't, unfortunately, Mattia isn't available on the video. I'll read this one out. We've heard about many Russian passports being distributed, particularly in the Luhansk region. What effect will Russian passportation have on the prospect of reunification and the peace process? And I'd like to put that to Kateryna.
Thank you for the question. Well, it's a general rule that on all occupied territories, the law of the sovereign state is in place. So whatever Russia does in terms of the passportization or its own system of judiciary and applying its law, for instance, in Crimea, in case of Crimea, it does not have proper legal effect. Whether it does impact the mentality and the human fabric of the region, yes, it does. And I think this is where the strategic communication component from Ukraine should come in force first. And second, it's also up to the international community to see how they recognize or not such passports. I'm not very updated on the topic. I'm not sure whether Ukraine has certain registries, for instance, of such people with such passports. But if they face less recognition and less freedom of movement with such passports elsewhere, I think it will be also an important impact.
Natalia, do you have anything to add on the passportization?
Yes, actually, it is not only passportization, but integration of these territories into the Russian political space. And what we heard a couple of days ago, that Mr. Borodai, one of the leaders of the so-called DNR, is going to be a candidate in the Russian State Duma elections, and he will be part of the party list of the United Russia, which is like a nonsense from any kind of legal point of view, right? But this just shows what kind of a international legal chaos in the area of Ukraine, Russia, and around we live, right? So it's like a completely crazy, I would even say, decision on behalf of the Russian authorities. But they will have 1 million voters in the republics. I mean, at least this is that they claim that about 1 million people received Russian passports there. So I would say that this would not affect Ukraine at this time, but this will negatively affect Russia. And we all can imagine how these votes will be counted, or etc. So I look at the passportization of the residents of these territories as a political weapon, clearly by Russia against Ukraine, or as a bargaining chip. So we will see.
We're coming towards the end of our allotted time, unfortunately. I think I've got another question which I'm going to read out briefly from Anna Lukyanina. Anna's asking, has there been any effect from the program of admissions to universities without exams for kids from the occupied territories? I think she means in Ukrainian government-controlled territory. Are there special programs for students from Donetsk and Luhansk regions? And how important is this initiative to win back the hearts and minds of the younger generation? I think this, Stas, are you able to take this question, winning back the hearts and minds of the younger generation through bursaries and programs in Ukrainian universities for refugee children from Donetsk and Luhansk?
Безперечно, можна, але я звик говорити такими цифрами чи фактами, то, на жаль, тут я не маю конкретної цифрової інформації щодо того, чи є якийсь конкретний чисельний результат, скільки людей, наприклад, з окупованої території, молодих людей вступили саме за цією програмою до українських вишів. Але це неймовірно важливо, тому що я знаю зворотню ситуацію, коли Російська Федерація кожного року надає акредитацію тому чи іншому вузу в окупації. Тобто тільки в Донецьку 5 найбільших вузів на сьогоднішній день вже частково або повністю видають дипломи російського зразця, тобто дипломи, які визнаються Російською Федерацією. І за їх офіційними даними, не знаю, скільки це можна їм довіряти, 2000 людей, молодих людей щороку отримують такі дипломи, і вони, звичайно, будуть інтегруватись не у місцеву і не в українську соціальну реальність, а у російську. Вони будуть емігрувати туди. Тому така програма з нашого боку надзвичайно важлива для цього. Так.
Thank you so much, Stas. And our final question, I believe Svetlana Linyavsky is waiting here on the video screen.
Yes, hello, Stas. It's an honor to see you. I've followed your case, and I'm happy that you're with us and you're safe. And I have been researching implementation of language policy in Ukraine at the time of war since 2015, and my data strongly points at since the policy is kind of more or less declarative, so people take the language matters into their own hands. And when I started looking at my interview data and social network data, the people who are subjected, as I call it, to linguistic vigilantism, turns out to be mostly people occupying the lowest kind of denomination jobs, often service jobs, cleaning jobs, service industry and the post offices, women who sit at the cashier's desks for hours, and they are demanded to provide services in Ukrainian. And when I followed a few cases, and I found out that those women were IDPs from Donetsk and Luhansk. Many of them had children, were single parents, and those kind of things resulted for them in the loss of employment, bitter resentment, public shame. Like one woman, a young woman's video has been watched over 300,000 times. Media hunted her for months, for 2 months after this incident. She couldn't get a job. And I think she was angry when I tried to talk to her. I found her through chain of, so those cases are prevalent in my data. And I wonder, considering that many of those people are passive users of Ukrainian. The article that I'm writing is called "I Understand You, but I Cannot Speak." So is there any program of reconciliation that would ease the implementation of language policy on the people who just, you know, in this realm of their age, you know, it's intersectionality, age, education, family status, and the possibility to work in the mainland using Ukrainian language, which does not exist for them. Thank you.
Natalia, are you able to answer this question?
Well, you know, I will try. I do see what you're pointing to, and actually, this is the case of again, instrumentalization of language for political reasons, and this is happening on both sides. By the way, you know, like this outcry that Russian language is being suppressed, and you know, everyone is Russophobic in Ukraine is very much entertained on the Russian side and in Russia. On the other hand, you know, there are extreme forces, of course, in Ukraine as well, who you know, impose, as you say, Ukrainian language. While the solution seems to be easy, you know, just create conditions for people to motivate them, right, to learn and to use the language. Actually, you know, what I can say is that, especially with the IDP population, these policies should be milder, simply given what people have been through, and to avoid, as you said, this conflating, you know, they do not let me, or they impose Ukrainian on me, or they do not let me speak Russian, and what happened to me before, and then it all comes in a very unhealthy combination. So I think that this sort of inclusive language policy is what is needed in Ukraine very much.
I agree.
And I think that's that note of inclusiveness is a very wonderful note on which to finish. So thank you, Svetlana, and thank you, Natalia. And we've discussed a wide-ranging number of subjects tonight: truth and reconciliation, justice, identity, changing viewpoints, and geopolitics. It's been a real privilege to be moderating the discussion. The viewers and listeners' questions, I think they've been absolutely phenomenal. And that, for me, that's a big indication of the success of the evening, the engagement with the viewers. It's been wonderful. I'd really like to thank our inspired panelists, Natalia, Kateryna, and Stas, for their full and frank viewpoints, Olesya and her team at the Ukrainian Institute for organizing the discussion. And I urge all of you not to forget about Donbass. Don't forget its coal mines, its steppes, its villages and cities, and above all, its people. Remember, this was the heartland of Ukraine, where the Zaporizhian Cossacks once roamed, where the steppe and its cities provided refuge to kulaks, dissidents, and political refugees. If you have friends or relatives there, give them a call now and then. Keep the dialogue going. Let them know that Ukraine and the broader European community still wants them and sees them as an integral part of what our poet Taras Shevchenko as translated by our beloved Ukrainian Institute scholar Vera Rich, called That Great Family, a Family New and Free.